Alright, so today we are going to learn about the irregular verb fero, fere, tuli, latus. Um, and we're going to sort of draw some comparisons between some of the other irregular verbs we've learned recently, namely wolo, malo, and nolo, and compare and contrast the two. Alright, so let's get started. So first off on the bat, let's look through the things we're really going to have to focus on here. And when we're learning fero, fere, tuli, latus, it's going to be really essential that you memorize these principal parts. That's going to be really the most crucial memorizing that you do with this verb. And I promise most of the rest of the other forms we're going to talk about, we're going to think about logical ways to construct them using information we already know. But you're going to have to memorize the principal parts, and it will be quick. Just repeat it aloud to yourself, and it will link in your brain both from an oral and from an auditory standpoint. Next up, there is some slight irregularities to the present tense, active and passive forms. So we're going to talk about that first. But otherwise, after the present tense, it's going to follow very standard third conjugation rules. Which you may remember is the same conjugation rules that we used for wolo, malo, and nolo. So we're going to really think of the third conjugation, which is already kind of the most irregular of the four conjugations we've learned. And think of the third conjugation as the conjugation we use for irregular verbs. And so we're going to use these rules, including this time for the present subjunctive. And then moving forward, just like before, the perfect system, and by the perfect system I mean the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tenses, both active and passive, are going to be completely normal for fero. We're going to use tuli for the perfect active stem, pluperfect active, and future perfect, and we're going to use latus to form all our passive forms for these tenses. And then finally, we're going to look at the participles and infinitives, and we're going to see that, again, those totally typical formation rules. It's actually going to be a really nice way to review your formation rules for all tenses and all forms of verbs, because there are going to be a lot of regular things. We're just going to have to really use our principal parts in order to help us form all these different tenses and such. All right? So let's start with the present tense. So here's the present tense. Fero, fares, fert, ferimus, fertis, ferunt. And the passive, feror, feris, fertor, ferimor, ferimini, ferantur. Alright, so when you look at this, there's some really weird forms here. But before you think that, well, you should memorize these probably by sound, there actually is some logic that you can look at here. First off, notice that, remember, we said fero is going to be third conjugation in a lot of ways. And one of the ways is that we can see these I's and U's, ferimus, ferunt, or ferimo, ferimini, ferantur, which are reminiscent of the third conjugation present. Remember I's and U's, rega, regis, regit, regimus, regitis, regunt. So that's pretty typical. We're also going to just notice here that there are certain forms where that I drops out, but the ST, mustis, ending remains. We're just dropping out that vowel. So it's weird. And on this next slide I'm about to show you, I've highlighted those forms. So we see fares, fert, fertis, there, right? You've dropped out the I that you're used to seeing. And then we have feris and fertor here, which have also dropped what you would normally expect to be a vowel there. Okay? And so as you've seen, I've now highlighted these forms. And so you can sort of see which ones sort of stand out of the pattern. But again, we see some similarities with the third conjugation. Just a couple quirks. Alright, so now let's move on to the future and imperfect tense. So for the future and imperfect indicative, we're going to be using the stem fer, which is the stem. You notice that for the present tense, the regular forms where we, like ferimar, ferimini, ferantur, we were using the FER stem as well. We're going to keep that here for both the future indicative, active and passive, and for the imperfect indicative, active and passive. And you may notice am, as, et, future, just like the third conjugation, and ebam, ebas, ebat, ebamus, ebatis, ebam. Totally typical endings for the imperfect as well. All right, so those are very typical, just like when we saw wolam, woles, wolet, I will want, you will want, he, she, it will want. Here with pharaoh, to bear, to carry. Feram, I will carry. Feres, you will carry. Feret, he will carry. All very standard. So we're going to move on, all right? All right, so subjunctive. Subjunctive. Always tricky, but this will serve as a nice practice for recalling your subjunctive formation rules for all verbs, because pharaoh is going to be entirely normal. We just got to rely on our principal parts and remember our formation rules. So I've given you a list of 6 verbs here. And try and go through them, remembering your rules for the present subjunctive formation, imperfect subjunctive formation, perfect and pluperfect, and seeing if you can use those rules in the principal parts of pharaoh to form the subjunctive versions of these indicative forms. And I've given you the answers on the next page, and we'll go over them together. So pause the video now if you want to try it on your own. All right, so let's go through it. Fährt, present tense, subjunctive, becomes ferat, because remember we eat caviar. We're going to have A's now. Feram, feras, ferat, feramus, feratis, ferant, all throughout the present subjunctive tense. And the passive forms are just going to be the same formula, but with rs, ter, murminy, and ter endings. Okay, so that's your present tense subjunctive. We eat caviar, still using that. Imperfect, ferebamor becomes feremor, because we want to remember that rule of take the second principal part and add endings on it. And pharaoh, fere, again, we're just taking that second principal part and adding endings on it. So it's actually completely normal. Even though the infinitive of fere is irregular, right? We don't have that E that we might expect there, a weak E that we might expect, F-E-R, weak E, R-E. That weak E drops out in the second principal part. It doesn't change. We still form the imperfect subjunctive the same way. Attach our endings onto the second principal part, fere. Now, when we look at the perfect active, to listhi becomes tuleris, our future perfect active indicative endings, which we use also for the perfect active subjunctive. So that's totally typical. Latam est becomes latam sit. Remember, we just convert that indicative form of sum into the subjunctive and attach it onto the fourth principal part. That's entirely normal. Tolerant, yep, still third principal part, plus your isse endings, right? Isse plus the endings, so to licent, which is typical. And then again, right, for the pluperfect form, we now take that eratus imperfect indicative form of sum that we attach to the fourth principal part to form the indicative pluperfect tense. We form that eratus into the imperfect subjunctive ascetus to make it pluperfect subjunctive form of pharaoh. Plati ascetus. Right? I know that's a lot of information, but it's all a review. Remember, it's all a review. So if that formulas feel weird to you, you want to go back and review your subjunctive formations, look at those sections of the textbook or old videos I've posted, or come set up a meeting with me, alright? But I just want to stress that all of these rules are totally typical for subjunctive formation. Alright, and now let's move on finally to participles and infinitives. So, again, this is really just a review of formation rules that we've done with regular verbs of every conjugation. And if you look at the forms of pharaoh, they're entirely typical. We're going to the same principal parts. Yes, they're wacky principal parts. The same principal parts we would for any regular verb. And we're getting our participles and infinitives from there. So you can take a look at all these different forms. I've just laid them out there so you can see just how they are typical. One thing that is interesting here is the present passive. You notice fere becomes fairy. We get that I, we stick it on. And that actually is a little bit weird, I will admit. So you want to keep an eye on that. Passive to be born, fairy. Alright, awesome. So, Now, there's some great Latin to English practice, right? So you're just recognizing what tense the form is and producing it. You don't have to create the form from scratch yet. And it's a good way for you to gain some familiarity with these forms. That's on page 193 of your textbook. I'll put the answers to that exercise in the notes section of this presentation, which you can find on your resource page. So feel free to reference that. Alright, I hope this presentation was helpful, and I'll see you in class.